I think they're two sides of the same coin. I think introspection and expression are each hobbled if the other is absent. I think that our self-care and our care for others are so intimately intertwined that if we try to isolate or exclude one from the other, both of them become impotent or ineffectual.
Hi, and welcome to Yoga Stories Project. Each session, I talk with yogis about their life and practice. I do this to inspire and empower you to bring yoga and mindfulness into your life. Who am I? I'm Hunter Clarke-Fields, mindfulness mama mentor. I coach smart, accomplished, overstressed moms on how to cultivate mindfulness in their daily lives. I've been practicing yoga and mindfulness for over 20 years and have taught thousands of women worldwide. I'm so glad you're here today, listening to Yoga Stories Project. I'm really grateful for your presence, for your ears. This is going to be a really cool episode. I actually just recorded it, and I'm so excited about it. I wanted to release it right away. I'll tell you about Sam Chase, who wrote this wonderful book, Yoga and the Pursuit of Happiness. We have this great conversation where he shares all kinds of awesome things, like the single most effective thing you can do to increase your happiness and how yoga and mindfulness help. And it's really wonderful. I think you're going to love this conversation. But first, I wanted to thank someone for an iTunes review, but I don't have any new ones. I'm so sad. iTunes reviews, the reason why I'm saying it, are such a really powerful way to share the podcast. I don't do any advertising for Yoga Stories Project. It's just me, and I really need listeners' help to spread the word and to keep the podcast going. And iTunes has this algorithm where if you do more, the more reviews something gets, the more likely it is to be found by people looking for something to listen to about yoga, about mindfulness. So if you go ahead and leave an iTunes review, to express my gratitude, I'd be really thrilled to write you a handwritten thank you note. I've been writing a few already, and you just have to email me your review and your mailing address at hunter@hunteryoga.com. And then before we dive into this episode, I'm just going to put a quick plug in there. In the conversation, we talk about mindfulness meditation. We talk a little bit about parenting as well. And I know how hard it is to start for people, and I know how it's hard without support. And so I just want to put in a quick plug. I have a few spaces right now open in my coaching practice. I only take a few one-on-one clients, and we work together for 3 months or 6 months, and it can be really transformative. So if you're interested in that, please go to hunteryoga.com under work with me, and you can learn more about it, or you can always just email me at hunter@hunteryoga.com to ask some questions, and we'll hop on the phone and have a call. I think that's it. That's all I want to say. Again, so grateful you're here. Let's dive right in. I have to tell you, I have been looking forward to having Sam Chase on for a while because he's written this really wonderful book that makes the deeper wisdom of yoga really accessible, and I've been really having a great time reading it. And so let me just tell you a little bit about him. Sam is the author of this book, Yoga and the Pursuit of Happiness, and it brings together Eastern contemplative tradition and Western scientific research. So it's this very down-to-earth guide. Sam leads yoga and meditation workshops and teacher trainings in New York and around the country, and he's designed yoga programs for the United Nations, the National Guard, New York University, Weill Cornell Medical Center, CEOs, athletes, families, and just about everyone in between. And he holds certificates in yoga and positive psychology from Kripalu Center and a master's from Harvard. So pretty impressive stuff. Thank you for coming to Yoga Stories Project, Sam.
Well, I'm so happy to be here with you.
Yeah, as you can tell, I'm a big fan of your book. I have it all underlined and highlighted, and I really am going to be recommending it highly to people for taking, the wisdom of yoga and making it very, very accessible. I really appreciate how you did that. And it's just very quick read, and it's very, you make all the stories are really wonderful. But, so your book is called Yoga and the Pursuit of Happiness, and you start it with this sentence. The first thing I want you to do is put this book down. So, so why did you start there? Tell me about that.
Well, I think because happiness is such a fundamentally subjective thing, I wanted to start the book by having people who read it pause to consider what happiness means to them. I joke in the book, asking someone what happiness is to them is sort of like asking them to get a mole checked out. Like, you ought to do it. You always put it on the back burner. And it's something that is always there for us, but I think we don't always give it the time and consideration and put it up front in our focus in the way that I'm asking to in the book. And I also know that once you get your head full of other people's ideas, it's hard to get them out. So I wanted to start the book from a place of contemplation and ask folks to take a few minutes and just sit down and consider, like, what's your operational definition of happiness right here, right now, before I pack a whole bunch of other junk in there for you to consider.
Yeah. I really like that. And in fact, I do have my little, I wrote it down in the book, what my happiness is. I thought, okay, I better do this. But it's interesting.
Oh, that makes me so glad.
Okay.
I knew when I was writing the book, I'm like, it's going to be so hard to get people to actually do exercises and journal about things and put this down and meditate. So I'm glad you did it. Good on you.
Oh, good. Thank you. But it's interesting as you talk about that. I'm thinking about, we were just talking about having children, and I was just thinking about this struggle that sort of I'm having with my children recently, which is like, well, we're going to do the screen time. We're going to do the entertainment after we do our responsibilities. So I'm kind of trying to get this idea that we take care of our responsibilities first, like brushing our teeth and, putting away our clothes and all that stuff. But as you say, like, you're asking people to find their definition of happiness, and it's not something we think about that often. I realize, like, I'm kind of doing what our society does to us, which is say we put off happiness until we get our stuff done that we have to do, right?
Mm-hmm. It can happen that way. All of us have stuff we got to deal with, and not all of that seems to fit into our working definition of happiness really easily. But you still got to do it. I'm working on the same thing with my son who's 3 years old. I find it comforting to know that when he's 6 or 9, I'm still going to be working on the same project.
Oh, good. I'm glad you're comforted and not daunted.
It just takes the pressure off. It lets me know I don't have to get it all done this year and make a responsible citizen by the time he's 4.
Yeah. Good luck with that one. So what made you want to write this book? And let's go back even further than that, because I want to know, like, what brought you down the path of yoga? I mean, that's something that I'm always really interested in knowing is what, you're a yoga teacher, you have been studying it, you've been looking at the scriptures and all these different things. What made you start with all this?
Well, I think the simplest explanation is it was a panic attack. I was finishing college, and I was always very bookish growing up. I was, did well in high school, graduated at the top of my class, did well in college, and was about to graduate at the top of my class. And my field at the time was economics, and I was invited to apply for some really prestigious scholarships, a Rhodes Scholarship and a Marshall Scholarship. And they would have allowed me basically to study economics anywhere I wanted in England. And these are very competitive programs. Thousands of people apply. They accept just a handful of folks. And I remember getting a call from the British consulate telling me that I'd won, that I was the recipient of one of these life-changing, career-making scholarships for graduate study. And I threw up. And I put down the phone and threw up, and then I got back on the phone and I said, "Thank you. I have to call you back." And I couldn't say yes. I just couldn't say yes. And that sort of terror that had gripped me didn't go away. I begged them for days to deliberate, which was highly unorthodox. They made a point of telling me, usually people just say yes, thank you, but if you need a few days, take a few days. And I couldn't say yes to it, and I didn't know why. And,
Wow.
and it was in retrospect, I call it the night that my soul puked, because I looking back on it now, realized that I was going down a career path that I had a lot of skill in and some passion in, but it wasn't what I was supposed to be doing. It wasn't where I was supposed to be building my life. And I didn't have any sort of language or self-understanding to describe it at the time. I was just doing the things I'd always been rewarded for doing. And it was like I got to the top of that mountain, and all I saw was more mountain down the horizon, and I didn't want to climb that mountain anymore. So I turned down the fellowship and sank into a really deep year-long depression. And
Wow.
midway through that time, I decided that I wanted to be able to touch my toes. This was about I jokingly say this was as much determination as I could muster in my life at that point. And the reason behind that was when I was a kid growing up, horribly unathletic, I had this memory of this thing called the President's Fitness Challenge, where they would make us do all these perverse exercises to prove our worth as a human being.
The sit and reach.
Yep, that's it. For me, it was the sit and reach. And did you have to do this when you were a kid? Did they have this?
I did the sit and reach. I'm one of those sort of naturally flexible yogi people that I like broke my school record for the sit and reach.
Oh, I was the other end of the spectrum. I remember to this day, I was a -4. Like they have the ruler going out for your toes forever. And they had another ruler just for me to measure my lack of flexibility. And for whatever reason, this had stuck in my mind. And and I said, I'm going to learn how to touch my toes. That's where I'm going to start resuscitating myself. And someone told me to try a yoga class. They said, yoga is great for touching your toes. So I went in and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I was being asked to move my body in ways that I'd never been asked to move before. I was being told to breathe and focus in ways that seemed complex to the point of impossibility. And half the class was in Sanskrit, which is like a 3,000-year-old dead language that I couldn't understand. And it just fried me. But there was this moment at the end of class after Shavasana, which I just called the nap at the end. There was a moment after the nap when I sat up, and I call it the moment where nothing happened. Like I wasn't happy, I wasn't sad, I wasn't anxious, I just was. And from where I was coming, that moment where I just was a significant improvement. And I had never felt that kind of, in retrospect, I would call it a stillness. And that's why I kept coming back. But the thing that kept me coming back was, in 6 weeks, I could touch my toes. In a few months, I was able to put away my inhaler. I'd grown up horribly, horribly asthmatic, and that started to subside. And over the course of a year or so, I felt like I was getting from yoga this toolbox for having a conversation with parts of myself that I hadn't been talking to for the better part of 2 decades. I started to understand a little bit the dynamics that were going on that caused me to throw up and have a panic attack and chuck what ought to have been the most important opportunity of my life thus far. And that became, as I became interested in the process and the deeper practices of yoga, that became a really important touchstone for me. Because when I decided I wanted to learn how to teach this practice and dive deeper into it, it meant a lot to me that I had a teacher in the beginning who didn't care that all I wanted to do was touch my toes. He made space for me. Mm-hmm. And when I wanted to figure out how to breathe better, he made space for me. And when I wanted to figure out what was going on inside my own heart and mind, there was space for me, and it was like, no matter which way my inquiry turned, I had a practice that was there to meet me. And that kind of, I would say, radically inclusive ethic has followed me throughout everything I've done in yoga. And I work hard to try and keep it going so that, if someone comes into my class and they want to be able to touch their toes, they can sit right next to the person who just wants to calm down so they don't throttle their family. So they can sit right next to the person who just wants their butt to look good in these jeans, and they can sit right next to the person who wants enlightenment in this lifetime. And I believe that we can build a practice that holds space for all those values, and I don't have to judge between them. And that means a lot to me because that was like my early entry into yoga was with a teacher and a group of teachers who really championed that ethic as well. But the thing that got me interested in this kind of approach, this book that I just wrapped up, was really the fact that I grew up as I would say, a dyed-in-the-wool intellectual and empiricist and rationalist. And to be quite candid, when I started doing yoga and it was working, when it was making a difference in my life, there was a part of me that wasn't going to let it work unless I could understand what was happening. And, in the yoga community that I was a part of, there was a lot of language and a lot of explanation that made it hard for me to buy in. There was a lot of, new age stereotype, all of which is fine and well and good, but I needed something else to hang my hat on. The intellectual part of me wanted to see research, which didn't really exist very much at the time. This is about, 10, 15 years ago. Yoga research and mindfulness research was really in its infancy. But I found it and I followed it, and it became, I would say, the other side of the coin for me. And as I have watched the conversation between science and these contemplative traditions evolve, I felt like there was a really important dialogue happening there, a sort of conversation to be had at that crossroads. And I decided I might as well have it. So that's how the book got started.
Great. I really relate to you and your experience. I mean, I think that you've described, without even realizing that's kind of what I had, is you've described this experience that I had, which was, wow, I feel so much better. My body's feeling better. My mind's feeling better. All of this stuff is feeling better, but I'm not necessarily, I'm not necessarily buying into some of the explanations that from the past or on this sort of spiritual new agey kind of side that have bought into it or that have explained it before. And this, I love that you wanted to know why and how was it working and I really relate to that sort of practical, intellectual approach. And then, why is this working? That's cool.
The funny thing for me was, initially, I had this impulse to try and demystify this practice to make it make sense. And the funny thing for me is, 10 years later, as I'm practicing and teaching, it feels more mystical than ever. For all of the science and the research that I've delved deeply into, I feel like I'm right back full circle where I started, which is face to face with a process that is fundamentally amazing and mystical to me. So I think my intention to kind of demystify or debunk the language and the practice that was being presented to me played out in a very different way than I was expecting. I feel like I'm more in awe of these practices than when I started. And in some ways they make intellectual sense, and in some ways they still defy that sense of intellectual grasping. But it was important for me to have another perspective, to bring more voices into the conversation about what yoga is and what meditation is and how they work. And it still is to this day.
So this interest in, understanding it from a more Western point of view, why this is working, why yoga and meditation, relieve our suffering and help us find this peace, etc., led you to looking into positive psychology. Tell me about that journey.
Sure. Well, it actually sort of started. It started with me trespassing, actually, because I ended up going to grad school at Harvard, and this was at a time in which a guy named Tal Ben-Shahar was teaching what had become Harvard's most popular class. It was a class on happiness and well-being and positive psychology. And this was a class that was like making the news around the country because there were like 800 some students enrolled here.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought to myself, I mean, it was in a different department and a whole different part of the campus. But I thought to myself, well, if there's 800 people there, they're not going to notice if one more person shows up. So I just started crashing the class. I would just show up and sit in the back. Nobody was like checking IDs or anything. So I would just come. And I found it fascinating. Before that, I had no idea that there was any scientific endeavor to study happiness whatsoever. And for a long time, there hadn't really been a significant one. Positive psychology is a really relatively new discipline in the field overall. And as the course unfolded, I felt like there were really strong overlaps between the ideas and the research being presented in that course from a very Western standpoint and the practices and the philosophy I was learning from yoga on the other side of campus in a very different way. Ironically, many years later, like fast forward a decade, when I had gone and done my teacher training at Kripalu and then come back and become part of the teacher training faculty at Kripalu, I literally bumped into Tal Ben-Shahar in the hallway at Kripalu. And I was like, oh my goodness, what are you doing here? And he said, I'm starting a positive psychology certificate program with Kripalu. And I said, all right, I'm going to sign up. I'll pay my tuition this time. I'm going to do it the right way. And so we sort of reconnected a decade later. And it gave me a chance to really synthesize ideas and practices from the yoga tradition with the tradition of positive psychology in a brand new way. And that was a really big fuel for this book and for a lot of my endeavors right now.
So positive psychology and yoga, and as far as creating an optimal experience for human beings, right? We have to look at the opposite of that. We have to look at our suffering and sort of the roots of our suffering. So did you find overlap between positive psychology and yoga as to what the roots of our suffering are?
I would say absolutely. Absolutely. And for me, I think the yogic philosophy understanding of suffering in terms of the kleshas really overlaps deeply with what research from positive psychology suggests in terms of our tendency to grasp or push away or cling to certain things that reinforce a fundamental sense of self. And underneath it all, I would say what yoga puts forth as the fundamental illusion that we have a self that is stable and permanent and separate as a root of our suffering, I think translates well into a lot of the research you see from positive psychology, where we find ways in which the stories we tell about ourselves and the way in which we frame our sense of self can either enable us to enjoy greater well-being or really become a cage and a constraint. And I think the one common denominator in both of those fields that is really important for me is a desire to take a really honest, open-eyed look at life as it really is, as best we can understand it. I always say to folks I'm working with, the promise that yoga is holding out to us is not a promise to be happier. It's a promise to experience life as it really is. And I think there is a kind of happiness to be found in that experience. And when people hear that positive psychology is an endeavor to scientifically study well-being and happiness specifically, oftentimes I think the knee-jerk reaction is to pull away as if it's some sort of evidence-based cult of positivity. But what positive psychology is really pushing for is a definition or an understanding of happiness and well-being that is big enough and robust enough to hold the experience of life as it really is. So I think they've got a different language and a different toolbox to talk about the same fundamental circumstance, which is how can we recognize our own selves and what's really going on in relationship to ourselves and the world around us, and how can we play an active role in that process. And for me, I see that in from the yoga side all the way back to the Bhagavad Gita, which is a fundamental story of someone taking a good look at what's really going on, freaking out, and then finding a practice and a philosophy that'll allow him to stand up, dust himself off, and do the work he's got to do. And it's, that's one of my favorite stories in the whole tradition of world literature. And in positive psychology, I think you see that play out in small but significant ways with all of these interventions and exercises and really tested tools that we can use to help us do our work in the world and be good citizens, good family members, good caretakers of ourselves and our community.
So I like how you say this honesty about life as it really is, and you mentioned sort of the ever shifting sort of ground that we are under, and our tendency to want to kind of create a solid and permanent sense of self, like in this sort of ever shifting experience. Now that's pretty deep stuff. It's really interesting. I was thinking about this as far as the sense of self. I think it's challenging to talk about this idea of our sense of self causing unhappiness. How would you explain that to people when you talk to people? How do you explain this idea of this sense of self causing unhappiness?
Sure. The analogy I often use is like if you were to imagine that your experience of life is sort of moving like a graph. It goes up, it goes down, it fluctuates, through this range of different experiences. You have great moments, you feel elated, you have boring average days, you get down in the dumps. So you've got this experience of life moment to moment that is in constant flux. And if you imagine sort of trying to make that into a graph, on that graph, there would be this bandwidth that we could call yourself. And when life is moving inside that bandwidth, when it doesn't cross those borders, you're okay. You feel like you feel secure and stable. That sense of self is really being reinforced. But when life crosses beyond those boundaries in either direction, like should be obvious, when we get really down in the dumps, when there's a tragedy, when we feel that sense of suffering, we'll do anything that we can possibly do to try and push life back up into a range where it feels comfortable for me to be me. But I think it also happens at the other end of the spectrum. Sometimes I think life gets so good or something happens that pushes outside of our familiar sense of self, even if it's an amazing thing, and we do whatever we can do to push life back into this box called me. The example that really drove this home for me is I remember when I was first invited up to teach at Kripalu in the Berkshires. So this was the place where I was trained to become a yoga teacher. All of my mentors had lived there in the ashram and were teaching there. And now I was invited to become a colleague with the people who had taught me. In the days and weeks going up to this workshop that I was invited to present, I was having the most obvious and transparent stress dreams in the world. Like I was having dreams that I drove up and all my teachers were standing at the front gate lined up saying, sorry, you can't come in. And I would wake up and I'd be like, come on, unconscious, like give me a little something to interpret. This is so obvious. So I go up to Kripalu, they let me in, I get to teach, and the workshop goes phenomenally. And it finishes and I'm on cloud nine. I can remember it as one of like the peak professional emotional experiences of my life. And I go to the cafe at Kripalu and I say, I'm going to buy a little chocolate bar and give it to myself as a treat, as a way of like celebrating this really great professional accomplishment. And I just sit down and I scarf it. And I go right back to the cafe and I buy another one. And I try to savor this one a little bit. and I finish it, and I go right back to the cafe for my third chocolate bar. And it's on my way to getting my third little chocolate bar that I realize I am eating my feelings right now. Not my negative feelings. I'm eating my positive feelings. I cannot handle being the kind of person who is able and qualified to teach alongside the mentors who have inspired me so much. And I'm eating to avoid having to feel what it's like to be that person, that accomplished, successful person.
Wow.
And I just turned around and sat down and sat there with this really uncomfortable feeling of accomplishment. And I think that basic habit of trying to squish life into a box called me is a root of so much of our upset and suffering. And what the yoga practice, I think, has always fundamentally been interested in is reversing that dynamic. Instead of figuring out how can I squish life into this box called me, we're playing a game where we're saying, how can I restructure and renovate and rebuild my own soul so that I can fit life as life really is?
That's a great, I think your vision that you said about sort of like a chart going up and down and this box, and sort of, I'm a very visual person, so my vision of that. And then your story, I really got this vision of, someone said a quote one time, like, you can't stop the surf, but you can learn to, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And I'm picturing like surfing that chart, right? Like the yoga practices and meditation are about learning to surf those waves, really emotionally.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong. I think both behaviors are valuable and essential. Like there are times for all of us when we're in a life situation and we realize like this container called me is not equipped to handle this experience, and we do our damnedest to change the experience instead of changing or working on the me that's having the experience. We all have to do that. I think what we don't often do as automatically or habitually is the other kind of work, what I call like the home renovation for your soul, so that you're able to feel and be present for more life, both the big ups and the big downs as well.
I like that, the home renovation for your soul. That's good. So this is, so your experience going into these big upsets, or these big great experiences, and seeing these sort of big low experiences, and you're looking at in this book how yoga, what are practices that we have from positive psychology and yoga to help us navigate these experiences. So I'm thinking about these very deep and transformative practices. I'm wondering your thoughts on, with all the suffering and the racial tension going on today, this past week, how can we, I mean, maybe you don't have an answer for this, and I'm sure, maybe it's just a discussion, but, how can we take this yogic wisdom and these practices, maybe about the self and the nature of suffering, etc., and use it to guide our actions in really intense moments in this particular country in the United States right now. What do you think about that, Sam?
Well, I don't have an easy answer, but I can tell you what my hope is. My hope is that all of these practices, from the tradition of yoga into the research and the pursuits of positive psychology and that whole field, my hope is that it inspires us all to reach out rather than to retreat in. And I think if there's a stereotype in the yoga community that I want to push back against hard, it's the stereotype that these are fundamentally self-serving, introspective practices. And don't get me wrong, I think there's some merit to that stereotype. And certainly, like if you read the Yoga Sutras, on its face, it looks like a textbook for stepping away from the world. But I'm most interested in how we can cultivate practices that get us more deeply engaged with the world, that help us become better parents, better citizens. One of the things that I would say the overwhelming point of research from the whole field of positive psychology as it pertains to happiness is that the single most important thing you can do to maintain and improve your own happiness is to nurture the quality of your social relationships. There's research that was looking at the happiest individuals in different groups, found that across the board, every single one of them had high quality social relationships. And we're talking about quality, not quantity here. It wasn't sufficient for happiness, but it seemed to be rather necessary. And when we look at practices from the yoga tradition, I am most interested in the introspective practices as preparation for stepping out into the world, not retreating, but engaging. And I think one of the things that I'm really, really encouraged by in terms of the overlap between scientific research and the yoga and meditation practices is that we're finding inside these practices a lot for the toolbox when it comes to civic engagement. There's research in different ways that metta meditation can lower stress response, and how mindfulness meditation can lower stress response, which is a major obstacle to altruistic behavior. If we're focused on ourselves, it's a real hindrance to being able to reach out and offer compassion to others. There's some really, really recent research into ways in which metta meditation and mindfulness meditation can lower implicit bias, which are the unconscious biases and attitudes we carry about other people, black or white or rich or poor, or old or young. These are deeply, deeply ingrained biases that we can measure. And it turns out that metta meditation and mindfulness meditation can make significant differences in how those biases show up. And the one that I find most encouraging, and it's a very small line of research and it's very, very new, but it's the first of its kind. A researcher named Brian Gibson and his partner Adam Lutke did a study showing how mindfulness meditation can reduce discriminatory behavior, which was, I think, really compelling and to me points us in the right direction with these practices. If we want to take an honest, open-eyed, open-hearted look at ourselves and the world around us, we have to have tools that allow us to stand in the face of a considerable amount of suffering. And when our fellow citizens are being shot, when the bodies of children are washing up on shores in Europe, I totally understand if there are days when we say, I can't look. I have to step back. I have to step back from this. And at the same time, I want to make sure that we have practices that help us witness, that help us look, that help us reach out into the reality of suffering rather than pulling away from it. And I think both yoga and positive psychology are giving us a lot of encouragement and reassurance that those practices are there and that it is possible.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, if the thing is, meditation and mindfulness meditation and loving kindness meditation can lower implicit bias. It's amazing. And it's amazing what they do for so many other areas of life where we have a stress response, where we need to, sort of overcome our own suffering. But, one thing you talk about in the book that I think is really a good point. You talk about how Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are how they are kind of a call to stillness, and how the Bhagavad Gita is kind of a call to action, right? And how there's a perception out there, there's very great, very wonderful, wise teachers, Thich Nhat Hanh has said that in order to have peace in the world, we must have peace in ourselves. And there's a perception that sometimes people feel that, I can't do anything, take any action in the world unless I'm, perfectly peaceful in myself, unless I have completely conquered my anxiety, or unless I am, I never get angry anymore at my kids or whatever it is. And what you point out in Yoga and the Pursuit of Happiness is that both of these practices of of turning inward and having that stillness practice and taking action outwardly really need to go hand in hand. Can you talk a little bit about that,
Sure,
Sam?
I do. I think they're two sides of the same coin. I think introspection and expression are each hobbled if the other is absent. I think that our self-care and our care for others are so intimately intertwined that if we try to isolate or exclude one from the other, both of them become impotent or ineffectual. And if there's like one pop culture pearl of wisdom that I would love to just like smash, it's this idea that you have to learn to love yourself before you can learn to love someone else. That our sense of self-care has to come first in every instance or be complete before we can offer care for others. And I can show you stacks of research from floor to ceiling that demonstrate how the process of caring and expressing compassion for other people nurtures and reinforces our own sense of self-compassion. The thing I really object to in there is just the first, the idea that we have to love ourselves first and most completely before we can offer any care to others. And, nowadays we even have like this lovely little bumper sticker analogy for it. Like you got to put your own oxygen mask on before you put on somebody else's oxygen mask. Mm-hmm. And don't get me wrong, like if your life is plummeting from 30,000 feet, yeah, you got to do that. You got to take care of yourself or you're not going to be of any good use to anybody. But most of us, I would argue, are not living a day-to-day life that is crashing from 30,000 feet. Most of us are just like taxiing more or less smoothly with some minor turbulence. And let's be honest, like when you're on a plane and they're talking to you about putting your oxygen mask on first before you put on someone else's, you're not paying attention. You're reading the Sky Mall catalog, looking at like dog beds or, loading up a movie to watch. And frankly, I don't know any mother who would actually do that when the plane starts crashing. Every mother I know is going to put their kid's oxygen mask on first. And I think there's value in that impulse. I think there's value in the impulse to reach out and to be of service. I don't think the two can be untangled. I think that if we are going out to be of work in the world and we have not taken any time for deep introspection, our work is going to be groundless because we don't know the instrument we're working with. And if all we ever do is study our own selves, we're wasting a potential that doesn't belong to you. It belongs out there in the world.
Mm. Yeah, I really like what you're saying about this because one thing I see in our culture as far as it pertains to parenting, to mothers, is that there's this long been a perception of putting ourselves last. So now myself and other people are saying, hey, your self-care is really just as important. But I like what you're saying about this because you're saying that there is a balance. There is, they are intertwined, they inter-are, that you can't have one without the other.
Absolutely. And I agree. Like, as for mothers, for fathers, for butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, like self-care is absolutely important. And we all ought to be engaged in the deep and essential process of coming to understand and love and care for our own selves. I just think it's not separate from caring for other people. And when I see people take in that little slogan and then start to wait, I just say, like, don't wait. Don't wait. And in the book, I say, like, if you were going to go to an ashram today and like flop down on the doorstep and say, I can't love myself, help, they're going to tell you to come in and do chores. Your first exercise in self-compassion is going to be helping somebody. And I think there's some wisdom in that too. And I do think there's wisdom in taking some time that's just for you. It's not about anybody else. That you don't owe anything, where you're not on the hook for anything, where you can clear a little space and be alone with your own self. I just think we need them both so much. And I see so much in the yoga community, especially this tilt toward self-care at the exclusion of relationship. And it seems to me tragic. I think most of the most rewarding and nourishing and transformative experiences I have had have been in relationship of some kind. And it would be a shame to cut that off, waiting to get myself figured out, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because, and oftentimes, and it is this back and forth, it's this flow and this balance between them because, I'm thinking about my own experience, like my relationship with my daughters and my oldest daughter, and when my anger, etc., was triggered when she was young, that was one of the things that made me say, whoa, I need to go back into that introspective place, into that meditative place so that I can help deal with this stress response. But it was the reason why I was going there was directly, intimately motivated by my relationship with my daughter and my desire to have a stronger relationship with her,
And if you don't give yourself a chance to dig deep into that relationship, it's not going to show you what you want to sort of turn inward to study and explore and inquire into. And I have total sympathy for that. I mean, man, I love my son and my daughter like nothing else, like a heartbreaking, almost like melting kind of love. And boy, when my son was like 2 months old and had colic and was shrieking in my ear, there was a rage like I have never felt before. And if I wasn't willing to step into that relationship wholeheartedly, I would never have been brought face to face with that and never had a chance to actually like step back and turn inward. I like to think of it like I jokingly call it a spiritual hokey pokey. Like you put your whole self in, take your whole self out, you do it again and again, and you shake it all about, and maybe that is what it's all about. but if we can do is go in and in and in, I would say we have yoga practice, a yoga problem.
Yeah.
And if all we can do is go out and out and out and out, we're going to be like a bull in a china shop.
Yeah, like a bull in a china shop. So I really appreciate your honesty about, how you felt when your son was 2.5, because I feel like that's something that people feel so much shame around talking about when they feel anger.
I did, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I felt like, I remember when my son was very young, I was eating a sandwich and he was supposed to be down for a nap. He was just learning how to nap. It would not be attached to us. And I was about to take a bite of the sandwich and he starts shrieking. And I have this moment when I'm like, all I want to do is eat this friggin' sandwich. And I have to put it down and go in and be with him because he needs me. And I felt in that moment like a horse that was being broken, in the sense that I knew I was being made available and trained, and my soul was being reshaped for the good work of being a father, but it didn't come easily. It was a real struggle. And like, I imagined myself like a horse that was just like bucking and pulling, and it took time for me to settle into that role. And I feel like I'm still settling into it. It's very different than it was in the beginning, but all of the myth of like your baby pops out, your heart pops open, and everything lands where it needs to be, like that myth did not come true for me at all. It was messy.
Yeah, it always is. And I feel like I love how you bring in your book, I love how you brought in the quote about Gandhi, about the Bhagavad Gita, to sort of bring it back to that, because you mentioned that the Bhagavad Gita is about war, it's about taking action in the story in the face of war, and how on the surface it's this, combative, warlike kind of thing, but it's just supposed to be this book about peace, right? So what gives? And I really think about, that metaphor of that, really this is a metaphor of action in the most difficult circumstances, like when you're like, kid, you're driving me crazy and I just want to leave and I feel tied to you, and all that is really a metaphor for those kind of circumstances in our life, and how those are really an incredible crucible for learning, I think, in some ways, much more so than going away off on a mountaintop. I'm not sure.
And I want us to have spiritual practices for those moments, not just for like the good vibes, sending out warm butterflies to the universe kind of practices, but like this is where the Bhagavad Gita starts. A battle is coming, and Arjuna decides to go stand right in the middle of the mess, in the most dangerous spot, alone. And what he sees freaks him out. And I love, one of the reasons I love the Bhagavad Gita as a story of yoga is it tells me, okay, that's where yoga starts, with someone who is brave enough to take a good, honest look around at what's really going on. Not just the slogans and the good vibes, but the real mess of our own hearts and minds and souls. And the first thing Arjuna does is he freaks out and he falls down, which tells me, okay, yoga is not for perfect people who have themselves together. Yoga is for people who are brave enough to take a real look around and honest enough to freak out sometimes. And that's where yoga starts.
I love that. Yay. Amen. High fives. So Sam, looking at, for anyone who's listening, I really can't recommend this book enough. You really lay it out in such a readable way. And I think it's very, very good.
Thank you.
What, if the listener can take, if you have so many different practices in the book, and I think that's really valuable because people can find sort of what works for them. But I look at, I am one of those people who is helping people to develop a meditation practice and develop a loving kindness practice and a home yoga practice and doing those things. And I know how hard it is because of course, the research where there was, they put people in a room by themselves, probably for 15 minutes or something like that. And they could either sit quietly by themselves or give themselves electric shock. Have you heard this? Yes.
Yeah. I read about it in the book. It's actually my favorite research study. Yeah. It was 66% of men and 25% of women shocked themselves at least once rather than being alone with their thoughts.
Yes.
My favorite is one guy shocked himself, I think, 140 some times in 15 minutes. So, there's one of my favorite quotes is from Blaise Pascal, who says, all of mankind's problems can be traced to our inability to sit alone with ourselves in a room. And I think there's some truth to that. It's a jungle in there. I think as an analogy, the Bhagavad Gita gets the nail right on the head. When we take a good look around at that battlefield, it's a mess for most of us. For me, certainly it is.
So looking at that and then looking at how hard it is for people to do these practices. Like, it's easy for us to say that meditation can lower implicit bias and can increase your, you have better sleep and clearer thinking and better relationships and lower anxiety and lower depression, all these wonderful things. People can read that and be like, yes, that's wonderful. But then when we sit down by ourselves, we want to shock ourselves with electricity millions of times. So what advice do you have for somebody, of all these practices in the book, what would you recommend as a practice where people can start that people can, how can they start to bring in this stillness part into their lives?
Sure. Well, I recommend for people to start small and start simple. I've over the years given all kinds of different suggestions about, 5 minutes or 10 minutes right when you wake up. I've worked with so many different people over the years that I generally just default to the position that the meditation you do is better than the meditation you don't do. So if I say, try 10 minutes first thing when you wake up in the morning and that doesn't work, try 5 minutes somewhere else in the day. Like, find a way to fit the practice into your life that will allow you to actually do it. And I think sometimes we falter with plans that are too grand or expansive. I generally say, don't make a New Year's resolution about it. Like, start small, start in a spot where you feel like it's going to stick, and watch how it grows. I generally recommend, if you pick a practice and you think you've got a structure that's working well, give it a few weeks, maybe a couple months, and don't pay attention to it. Which is to say, like, in the act of meditating and in whatever yoga practice you're doing, like, try not to micromanage it and evaluate it while it's happening. I think there's some value, some virtue in creating a little bubble or a little space where you say, I'm going to let this practice drop into my life for a couple weeks. And after a little while, then I'm going to take stock. But I will say, well, I'm not going to encourage you to micromanage the process as it's happening. Notice what starts to happen in your life when you're not meditating, or after the meditation, or after the yoga practice. That's where I think we're going to find real value. That's what I'd encourage folks to lean into. As far as which practice to take up, I found it varies so much from person to person. I started with a very traditional concentrative meditation on breath. I got a lot of mileage out of that. Nowadays, I do a metta meditation, a loving kindness meditation almost every day, and that's become, I would say, my biggest, most central meditative practice. But it's changed. There were times in my life when I meditated every day with a 3-year-old and a 3-month-old. That doesn't happen every day anymore. And maybe my biggest bedrock encouragement would be to, like, give yourself permission to be a human being in all of this. Like, lots of self-compassion. I would say if you go into that process with any big bias, make it a bias of self-compassion. Because if you're going in to make a change in your life, you're implicitly acknowledging that the circumstances of your life are at least a little bit other than you would like them to be. So let's meet that with compassion rather than piling on a whole bunch of blame and other kinds of stuff. That's carried me quite a ways. I wish I could just say, do this meditation at this time of day for this many minutes and everything will fall into place. But to me, that seems almost crass. Like, people are different. We've all, the thing that lights me up is not going to be the thing that lights you up. And the thing that lights you up today, probably not going to be the thing that lights you up 5 years from now. And I want, most of all, for us to have practices that meet us right where we are. So you don't have to pretend. And then practices can move us in a way that we want to be moved. And the way you want to be moved is a little different than mine, I suspect.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you're looking at, thank you for that. And I think that's really very good advice. You have a 3-year-old and you have a 3-month-old who, knock on wood, is sleeping better. Thank goodness. He said. How do you think all this mindfulness is, of course you can't know because there's no control you to tell, but how do you think all of your practices have impacted your parenting and so far in your journey?
The best thing it gives me is, and I would say this is not necessarily different from daily life, but as a parent, I find it particularly important. It gives me some space. It gives me a little bit of room between an impulse and a reaction, a space where I have a little choice, a little freedom to make a more conscious response. And it's funny because my son at 3 years old can see when it happens. If he's like being really disobedient, and there'll be times when I just pause and I close my eyes and take a breath, and he'll go, Daddy, are you happy? And I'll pause and I'll say, no, honey, I'm frustrated because you know what the rules are and you're not behaving. And then he'll say, I can choose to behave. And I'll say, why don't you try that? And sometimes he will, and sometimes he won't. Wow. But I found 2 and 3-year-olds to be like my son, at least, he really wants to see like where the reaction is, where the response is, and what's going to get a rise out of me and what's going to get a laugh out of me. And I can see him soaking that up like a sponge. And my recommendation for parents who want to instill mindfulness in their kids, my overwhelming recommendation is to model it. To do it yourself, and for the longest time to just let that be enough. Like, I don't need to teach my son how to sit down and close his eyes and do ujjayi breath. I need to teach my son by being a mindful person where I can, and like calling myself out when I just lose it, and going back to him and explaining, like, yeah, Daddy just screamed because he got so mad, and I wish I didn't, but I did. So now let's talk about it. And it just, that these practices have given me lots of space to step back and also to come back again, just like we come back to the breath again and again in meditation. You know, if I'm with my son and something sets me off and I can't catch it before it happens, I can come back and we can talk about it. And we do that all the time now. This kid loves to talk about things so much. It's like his favorite refrain. When something happens he doesn't understand, he goes, "Can we talk about this?" And I would like to think that the fact that my wife and I have always just come back to talk to him about what's going on and tried our damnedest to really be checked in and present to what's happening for us moment to moment. I like to think that that's made a difference.
Wow.
But it's not a magic pill. It's not like I meditate in the morning and then my son never gets a rise out of me. You know, I have the same rhythms of daily life as everybody else, but it helps me find some space so I can make a choice rather than just being pushed and pulled by constant habits and reactions.
That's wonderful. I love that. I love that description of it, because you're saying you're just, you're very honest. You're very real. You're real, but you're giving yourself that space. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And that mindful parenting is not walking around only saying measured things
Yeah.
and being positive. And like mindful parenting, I think, is being a real, full individual, but aware of that individuality, aware of that process, and willing to like step into it and recognize it for what it is and negotiate around it where we can and surrender to it when we can't, and be open about it. I feel like my son, especially at 3, is really valuing that openness. Like he wants to just like crack open our hearts and see what makes them tick. And I feel like these practices have given me a vulnerability and an ability to let him see that in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not about always being calm and yogic and perfect. I love that. Thank you so much.
And that's
for your
totally
sharing.
my path. Like that's totally the place I want to go when I'm pretending to be mindful. I get really calm around him. And kids are great teachers that way. Because if I get super calm around my son when he's misbehaving, he'll go, "Are you mad?" And then I have to confess, yes, I actually am mad and I'm trying to hide it from you because I'm pretending to be mindful right now.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love it. I love that, Sam. Thank you so much. So, I mean, it's been amazing talking to you. I loved your book so much. I can't recommend it enough to the listener. It was really good. And such a great, concise and smart and funny explanation of everything. So how can the listener find you, Sam? Where can we find you in the world?
I have a website, samchaseyoga.com. I'm on Facebook. I don't do Twitter. I don't do Instagram. I try to do real life as much as possible.
Good for you. Cool. And the book is Yoga and the Pursuit of Happiness. So go find it wherever you can. Thank you so much, Sam. I really had a good time talking to you, and I really appreciate the work you've done and the choices you're making. And I love your clear and really grounded, down to earth way of talking about these deep things. Thank you.
Well, likewise. Thanks for having me on.
I hope you'll go out and get Sam's book, Yoga and the Pursuit of Happiness. It really is awesome. I loved talking to Sam. So many wonderful gems in this episode. I love that quote, all of mankind's problems can be traced to our inability to sit with ourselves. So if you enjoyed this, if you enjoyed it as much as I did, please support the podcast. Let us know how great it was on iTunes with a review. Remember, it's a really wonderful way to help the podcast reach more ears, and we're kind of at the mercy of iTunes, so we need your help. I need your help. And remember, I also have a couple of open spots currently right now. This is summer of 2016. If you're listening in the future, you can always email me too, but I have a couple open spots in my coaching calendar. And so if you're interested in that, you can look at hunteryoga.com/work with me. And if you want any more information about this episode, you can always go to yogastoriesproject.com. You can share the episodes at yogastoriesproject.com too. So thank you so very much for listening, my friend. I hope you have a truly wonderful week. Namaste.